and welcome back to the online learning session. Let us see the topics to be covered today. Unit 5, Abolition of Slavery. Unit 6, Revolution in Everyday Life. And number 3 is Conclusion. So let us begin our discussion with slave trade. Students, first of all, we need to understand that what do we actually mean by slave trade in the context of this particular region. For example, here we are concerned about France, here we are concerned about Europe as a continent, America as a continent, and Africa as a continent. So we need to first of all understand the basic structure of this slave trade, how it was being carried out. So as you can see here, students, that the colonies in the Caribbean, the region is Caribbean, so these three were the colonies. Martinique, Guadeloupe and San Domingo were important suppliers of commodities such as tobacco, indigo, sugar and coffee. Students, we see that the region of the Caribbean comes under a very fertile region as far as plantation crops or plantation agriculture is concerned. So we see in this slide that tobacco, indigo, sugar and coffee are being supplied. Now we see that there was a reluctance of Europeans to go and work in distant and unfamiliar lands. So we see that they did not want to go to unfamiliar lands, which meant a shortage of labor on the plantations. Clear? So how was this shortage of labor on the plantations met? This was met by a triangular slave trade, clear, between Europe, Africa and the Americas. So basically the laborers were traded among these three regions of the world, and this is how the slave trade began. You can clearly see in this map that this is European continent, this is the African continent, and this is your North American continent, and how you can see the triangular slave trade is being carried among these three regions of the world. Now students, let us try to understand this slave trade in details. So we see that the slave trade began in the 17th century, first important point to be noted, and French merchants sailed from the ports of Bordeaux and Nantes to the African coast. It means they sailed from France to Africa, and there they bought slaves from the local chieftains. So French merchants went from France to Africa, and there they bought slaves. Let us see the next point. The slaves were then branded and shackled. Let us see this. The slaves were branded and shackled. The slaves were packed tightly into ships for the 3-month long voyage across the Atlantic to the Caribbean. There they were sold to plantation owners. Okay, the exploitation of slave labor made it possible to meet the growing demand in European markets for sugar, coffee and indigo. As we have learnt previously that there was a shortage of labor, therefore this shortage of labor was met by this triangular slave trade among Europe, Africa and the Americas, and it was very beneficial for the European markets in terms of crops like sugar, coffee and indigo, and therefore with the help of these slaves they were able to grow for the European markets. Okay, let us see the next point. Port cities like Bordeaux and Nantes owed their economic prosperity to the flourishing slave trade. Throughout the 18th century there was little criticism of slavery in France. Now again, this is a very important point, students. We see that the slave trade began in the 17th century. Throughout the 18th century there was a little criticism for slavery in France. Okay, it means that no one was getting completely against this system, and therefore we also see that port cities like Bordeaux and Nantes owed their economic prosperity to the flourishing slave trade, because we see that the merchants from these port cities traveled to Africa where they bought these slaves. Next we see an important development by the National Assembly, wherein we see that they held long debates about whether the rights of man should be extended to all French subjects, including those in the colonies. Here, what do you actually mean by subjects? Subjects mean the people who belong to France. Okay, And here the National Assembly held debates whether the rights should also be extended to the people of France over there in the colonies. Here they exactly mean the slaves. But we see that the National Assembly did not pass any laws. Fearing what? Fearing opposition from businessmen whose incomes depended on the slave trade. Now you can establish a very quick connection between all these aspects. We see that this is National Assembly and this is a businessman. Clear? The income of this businessman depends on the slave trade. Okay, the slave trade. That is why, and these businessmen also helped National Assembly get into power. Therefore, we see that the National Assembly could hardly go against the businessman class because they feared the opposition from businessmen who also helped the National Assembly get into power. I think this is clear to you people. Now we see that it was finally the convention which in 1794 legislated to free all slaves, a very important development from the convention side in the French overseas possessions. This however turned out to be a short-term measure. 10 years later Napoleon reintroduced slavery. Now we see that in 1804 Napoleon crowns himself as the Emperor of France, and when he crowns himself as the Emperor of France, he re-establishes slavery. He reintroduces slavery. Okay, so therefore this very good conventions move could not last long. Now let us see the next point. Plantation owners understood their freedom as including the right to enslave African Negroes in pursuit of their economic interests. Now this is a very bad thought developing in the merchants, the plantation owners. They were developing a thought as they understood it was their freedom and right to enslave African Negroes in pursuit of their economic interests. And we see that slavery was finally abolished in French colonies in 1848, which is the 19th century. Now students, we move on to the last unit of the chapter, the revolution and everyday life. Now this unit actually focuses on summarizing all the aspects we have learnt in the chapter. That what is revolution and how does it affect our everyday life? What do we actually come to learn from revolution and how does it actually change the course of time? What reforms does it bring? How does it revolutionizes things in our society? So let us learn this. The years following 1789 in France saw many changes in the lives of men, women and children. Because what had happened in 1789, the French Revolution itself took place in 1789, and the representatives of the third state, mainly the common man, were in the power as National Assembly. Second, we see the revolutionary governments took it upon themselves. Here we need to highlight one very important point. We are here talking about revolutionary governments. Clear? Okay, those governments which wanted a change, a positive change in the society, took it upon themselves to pass the laws that would translate the ideals of liberty and equality into everyday practice. Okay, so the revolutionary governments ensured that the ideals of liberty and equality was practiced in everyday life. Okay, so the laws were made accordingly, which could leave an impact on the people's mind. In the third point, we see one important law that came into effect soon after the storming of Bastille. Now in the comment section you will tell me what was Bastille. So a very important development in 1789, we see that the censorship was finally abolished and the press was made free of any kind of shackles. Next, we see that in the old regime, all written material and cultural activities, all the written material and the cultural activities like books, newspapers, plays could be published or performed only after they had been approved by the censors of the king. This is what we were learning about, the censorship right now, how the censorship was there in the old regime in the society of France, that any of the written material or cultural activities, written materials like books, newspapers, plays, etc., could only be published or even performed after they had been approved by the censors of the king. Now, the Declaration of Rights of man and citizen, we see the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen proclaimed freedom of speech and expression to be a natural right. Now this was made into a natural right, and therefore we see that in 1789 the censorship was finally abolished, and this was made into a law in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. Let us move ahead, students. Now we'll see some more points regarding newspapers, pamphlets, books and printed pictures flooded the towns of France. Now we see what was the result of the abolition of censorship. We see that all the kinds of printed materials, all the possible printed materials at that point of time, like newspapers, pamphlets, books and printed pictures, flooded the towns of France. It means a huge supply was there in the towns of France of all these printed materials, from where they had traveled rapidly into the countryside. So we see that from towns to the countryside there is a huge supply of all the printed materials after the abolition of censorship. Next we see, students, that they all described and discussed the events and changes taking place in France. What did they discuss? They discussed about the revolution. They discussed about the changes taking place in France. Freedom of the press also meant that opposing views of events could be expressed. Each side sought to convince the others of its position through the medium of print. Now there was a system of checks and balances gradually making its place in the French society. Now there were fair and more chances of expressing the opposing views of events. So therefore nobody could write anything or nobody could say anything. Whatever was to be said, whatever was to be written, was to be proved first of all, and therefore it was checked through a system of checks and balances, and in which we see that each other sides needed to convince of its position through the medium of print. Okay, let us see the next point, students. We see plays, songs and festive processions attracted large number of people. Now people could express themselves freely. Okay, as we have seen in the censorship, not only the written material but also the cultural practices were censored. That's why here we can see that people can now express themselves freely in the forms of plays, songs and festive processions. That's why all these aspects, all these different activities attracted large numbers of people. Next we see this was one way they could grasp and identify with ideas such as liberty or justice that political philosophers wrote about at length in texts which only a handful of educated people could read. Okay, so what do we learn from this point? We learned that a handful of people were literate at that point of time in the European society. Okay, let us try to understand this by a following example, students. For example, let us consider this is your country India, okay, and this is the country of China. Okay, so if an Indian goes to China and if that person doesn't know to speak Mandarin, of course that person is not going to express himself or herself in China, and the Chinese people will also not understand this Indian person. But what happens if this person uses a sign language and this sign language is understood by these Chinese people? Okay, so that is a solution at this point of time. So here we see what could not be read was expressed. Let me repeat this: what could not be read by a certain section of the society, because as we have already seen that as only a few sections of the society was literate in European society at that point of time. Therefore we see that this was one way they could grasp and identify with the ideas of liberty or justice, okay, which political philosophers wrote about at length in texts which only a handful of educated people could read. So what was not read was expressed through plays, expressed through songs and festive processions, which tried and which actually attracted a large number of people. So this is how people were expressing their freedom after the abolition of censorship. Now we come to the conclusion of this chapter, students, and we will see about Napoleon Bonaparte in this section. In 1804, Napoleon Bonaparte crowned himself as the Emperor of France. Okay. Now, who was Napoleon Bonaparte actually at that point of time? He was the military general of France. Now we see he set out to conquer neighboring European countries, dispossessing dynasties and creating kingdoms where he placed members of his family. So when Napoleon came to power in 1804, he actually sent his armies on the boundaries, on the borders of France, okay, and which also in a sense was meant to conquer the territories outside France and to annex those territories in France. Next we see that Napoleon saw his role as a modernizer of Europe. Through all these means, through all these measures, he tried to project himself as a modernizer who was bringing about a lot of reforms in the society. But we see that all these measures, all these administrative reforms were brought about for simplifying his work as a ruler. We see at the end that all these reforms actually favored Napoleon. Let us go through those reforms, students. We see he introduced many laws such as protection of private property and a uniform system of weights and measures provided by the decimal system. So basically we see here that he provided the protection of private property and he unified the system of weights and measures. There were lots of different kinds of systems of weights and measures going on in Europe at that point of time. So he actually introduced the uniform system of weights and measures provided by the decimal system. What do you think? Was this to favor the people? Yes, to a certain extent, but if we see in the long term, this was a step which was in turn going to benefit Napoleon himself, because they would have simplified the way in which the tax would be calculated and therefore to be collected. Initially many people saw Napoleon as a liberator. That's why we see that initially many people saw him as a liberator, when many people could not understand what his policies were all about, who would bring freedom for the people. But after that we see that Napoleonic armies came to be viewed everywhere as an invading force. Of course we see that he was invading different territories, therefore he was annexing different territories, and he was actually implementing what is known as the Civil Code of 1804, also known as the Napoleonic Code, where he introduced lots of administrative reforms, including protection of private property, introduction of an uniform system of weights and measures, etc., minimizing the currency from about 39 currency to 2 currencies. Okay, so all these steps were there in the Civil Code of 1804. Now we see that actually he was considered to be a growing threat for all the monarchs of that point of time surrounding France. So we see Britain, we see Austria, we see Russia, and we see Prussia. These four countries come together and they defeat Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. So Britain, Austria, Russia and Prussia came together. These four countries, which were actually being at that point of time ruled by monarchs, came together and they with combined power defeated Napoleon. We see many of his measures that carried the revolutionary ideas of liberty and modern laws to other parts of Europe had an impact on people long after Napoleon had left. So whatever changes he had brought, it had an impact on the minds of the people. It was not like that the reforms which were brought about by Napoleon had nothing to do with the effects. Next we see that the ideas of liberty and democratic rights were the most important legacy. Now we are into the concluding phase of this chapter, students. Here we need to understand what is the crux of this chapter, the ideas of liberty and democratic rights. We see democratic principles to be gradually framed in the world through all these courses. So idea of liberty and democratic rights were the most important legacy of the French Revolution, were the most important outcomes which we got, which the people of the world got from the French Revolution. These spread from France to the rest of Europe during the 19th century, where feudal systems were there, and they tried to establish equality and justice in the society. So hence we come to the end of the chapter, students. Now you are required to answer the textbook exercises, the relevant assignment, and submit them in time. Thank you.